All right, so we transition over to the college basketball side of things here. And again, putting these into two separate segments for our listeners out there that do listen to the segments. With college basketball, man, we talked about this a little bit last week when you came on the Wednesday show. We'll talk about it here again. The totals market. I mean, it's just every day it feels like the same thing.
Yeah, the totals market's been pretty consistent that, it's going to get bet down quite a bit across the board. So if you like the over, you want to wait. If you like the under, you want to bet it earlier. It's been pretty consistent on that's been the case. There's been quite a few games going to overtime here lately. I will say that, I ran off 10 straight college basketball wins, and then I lost 2, both last night. Both of those games went into overtime to ruin an under. So that wasn't real fun. But, obviously that's going to happen if you're betting a lot of unders, and I have been betting a lot of unders. To me, this is still a situation where you want to lean toward the under based on the rule changes, especially in the neutral site games. Keep an eye on those games. Those are games that have done far better to the under to start with. And now you have a farther out 3-point line. That is a pretty big adjustment for some of these teams. So I would continue to lean toward the under, but just know that, some of these games will get bet down too much when you maybe should be playing an over based on some tempo changes or things like that.
Yeah, the tempo change stuff is important. We're going to touch on that here a little bit too. And keep in mind that, early on in the year, again, we're only working with 3 or 4 data points for most of these teams here. You may have games where you just play somebody who plays at a fast tempo. You're clearly the better team. You're going to run with them because you're going to have some fun. You're going to go out there and hang some big offensive numbers. So keep that in mind. There probably are some outliers here where teams have maybe played an 80 possession game or 78 or something like that, where for the course of the season, they'll probably be around 68 or 69. They've just played one outlier type of game. You want to make sure that you're factoring that into the equation as much as you possibly can. Because again, you may go out there and beat a team by 40 because you could play a 78 possession game and let them run and let them chuck up threes and give you back possessions. You also may play some of these games in the non-conference where the better team is going to slow the game down. You may be a team that's going to play to 75 possessions a night, but you may have played a 63 or a 64 just because that other team's been better than you and dictated the flow of the game.
I think that's a fantastic point. I really do. I think that especially the case where you have a better team than the other team and you're okay with running with them. In a normal game, you may not be okay with running. Some of the teams look a little bit faster than what they will later because they were okay with running, having a little bit of fun, if they're playing a MEAC team or a SWAC team. But now when they get into the meat of their schedule, we're going to find out what they really are.
Yeah, it's definitely an important thing. Again, there's a lot of nuance that goes into college basketball handicapping, in particular on the total side. One of the reasons why you're so good at it here. And you've isolated 4 teams that have made some pretty substantial tempo changes. These look like they're going to stick. These are not the teams that I just talked about where, maybe you play a team that's going to really slow you down or you play a team where you're comfortable with speeding up. These are teams that are actively changing what they're doing from a tempo standpoint. We start with the teams that are moving faster to open the 2019-2020 season.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight a few of these because I feel like these could be pretty helpful to listeners. James Madison, much faster pace. It's a team that, in the past years has been pretty slow paced. Their average possession length was 18.8 seconds last year, 13.3 seconds so far this year. 5.5 seconds is way, way faster. And that's about as big of a change as you'll see, especially through a few games. Virginia held them to 34 points, so their numbers are a bit skewed so far this year. I'm going to look for overs in the right spots with them. I know they play Old Dominion coming up. Old Dominion's a low-scoring team. Unless that total's really low, I'd be a little bit skeptical of playing an over in that game. But Coach Rose specifically said he wants his team to play much faster this year. Before the season, they are definitely doing it so far this year.
And let's look at this in the proper context, too. Even their game against Virginia, they only had 34 points, but even their game against Virginia, 69 possessions. Yep. You don't see Virginia playing a lot of 69 possession games, especially in the non-conference. Their other 3 games, 77, 86, that was against the D3 team, Shenandoah, and 77 again against George Mason. So they even got Virginia to play a little bit quicker, which really speaks to how much they're forcing the issue.
Yeah, definitely. You just couldn't throw a rock in the ocean. But you've got them playing 77 against George Mason. George Mason plays pretty slow as well. So I think that tells you quite a bit, too. James Madison definitely pretty consistent on moving their pace up a lot here this year. MTSU, the second team, second-year coach here. They were ranked 176th in average possession length last year. 11th so far this year. This is one where I'm not quite as convinced that, this is definitely a one that you just want to bet an over every single time. They've played two bad teams. I want to see if they keep playing really fast here. It's a team that I've got on my radar. Not one to the degree of James Madison, like I said, where, I just feel like overs will have a lot of value. MTSU, a team where I think they're playing faster, but I want to make sure they actually are, kind of to the point that you made earlier.
Yeah, that's a team that they've turned the ball over a lot here so far. They're really struggling on 2-point shots, but shooting 43% from three. And again, with the 3-point line move back, maybe that's one that you kind of want to look. Even though you've got this tempo change, you do wonder about them offensively and where they're going to end up here when all is said and done. So that's one that's even a little bit iffy because they probably have some offensive regression coming here too, especially because, as you mentioned, they've played two, Division III teams so far.
Yeah, it's just one that I'd be cautious about compared to James Madison. Let's talk about a couple teams that are playing slower here. UC Riverside. I said something to you about this last week off the air. I was looking at the numbers, and I just could not believe how slow they were playing. They actually played faster in their last game. They've been losing, so they had to play a little bit faster. But UC Riverside, 22 and a half seconds on average being used. So basically, obviously they're running the shot clock under 10 consistently every single time. This is as slow as you're ever going to see. You don't see teams use up 22 or 23 seconds to the shot clock on average. They were at 20 exactly last year. I couldn't bet overs with this team. I will say the odds makers are catching up here. They had a total of 116 and a half on Sunday against Pacific. I wanted to take the under there. I ended up not taking it, and I'm pretty sure that game did go under the total. But UC Riverside, a team that, depending on who they're playing against, if you think they are the better team and they're not going to have to speed up because they're behind, I would look to play unders with them.
Yeah, it was a 58-51 game there on Sunday at Pacific. Not great offensive numbers all the way around there in that one. And that's what this looks like too, is it looks like they're slowing down the tempo because they are bad on offense. I mean, they are not good at all whatsoever. And factor that into the equation when we get into Big West play with them too, where that's a conference that traditionally, trends toward the under anyway. We could see some very anemic totals in that conference this year.
Yeah, I would expect so. I think that Riverside will play a lot of really low-scoring games. And like I said, if they're playing against somebody else who's better than them that's going to play fast, I would be cautious about taking the under. But if you think Riverside has a decent chance in the game, I think the under has some value. The second team I was going to say for slower tempo, UIC. Now, this one really stands out to me a lot. They were 20th in pace, in overall pace 2 years ago, 68th last year, and they're 265th so far this year. I know this team is shorthanded due to injuries, so there is some chance that they'll speed back up, but I really want to keep an eye on this team. There could be some undervalue on them for a little bit if they continue to play this way because they played so fast the last couple years. It's a really big adjustment.
And also, it looks like they're not very good offensively. 0.643 points per possession against Memphis, 0.76 against Ball State, 0.816 against Bradley. Now, those are three okay teams. I mean, Ball State's not bad. Bradley's not bad. Memphis, of course, as we know, everybody loves them. So maybe they find their offensive rhythm a little bit here with home games against Bobby Morris, Mercer, and Canisius. But still, like you said, one to pay close attention to because this could be a very dramatic change. And again, it's Illinois, Chicago. We talk a lot about under-the-radar teams. We've got 3 under-the-radar games that we're going to talk about here on today's show. These are things that it takes a while for the risk managers and the bookmakers and the odds makers to factor into the equation. So that's why we harp on a lot of these games, a lot of these teams, especially early on in the year, try and find you some good value.
Yeah, and that's what I've been able to do here, even in the totals market, is just play a lot of these smaller school totals to where, I'm not playing Duke versus somebody else big name. I'm playing these games of, Merrimack versus Dartmouth and games like that to where, it's way under the radar. They're teams that are kind of unknown to the general population, but if you pay really close attention and you start finding some trends, you can find some pretty good value there.
Speaking of some trends here, you've got one for us. Like I said, we've got about 3 or 4 data points for just about all the teams out there. I think I've seen a couple of teams have only played 2 games. Obviously, you've got some against Division III types of teams and stuff like that. But in this portion of the season here, mid to late November, games 4 through 6, you found something pretty interesting.
Yeah, and this is not an angle where I'm just suggesting that people blindly follow it. It's favorites are 5.5 points. Favorites of 5.5 points or more are 52.2% ATS in games 4 through 6 since 2005. Now, I know 52.2% is not going to get you where you want to be, but that's a 3,000 game sample size. So this is a lot of games, non-conference games only during this time. And that's what most of them are, unless they do some kind of silly, play the conference games early in the season like some teams have so far this year. But don't be afraid to lay it with favorites during this period. When their opponent's coming off an ATS cover, the rate improves quite a bit, gets you north of 53%. Also note that unlike the rest of the season, home favorites have done way better than road favorites in this time period, which really is pretty interesting. Part of it is most of the teams who have been favorites have been at home because you're playing a really weak opponent. But I think that this is that period where you're playing a lot of non-conference games against teams that are just really weak. And it's hard for the odds makers to know how weak is that opponent compared to you. If you've got a fairly decent sized number, I wouldn't be afraid of laying it this time of the year.
Yeah, and I think too, you got some teams playing a first road game. You've got some teams that, are out traveling the country, playing all those paycheck games where you're going to get worn down early on in the year, just being on a plane all the time. You go from airport, hotel, arena, airport, hotel, arena. Some of the teams do that. And I mean, we all know who they are. Teams like Long Beach have done it. Obviously Mount St. Mary is the team that gets a lot of travel miles. We saw Winthrop play 4 road games in like 8 days in different parts of the country. So you got that part of the season here too. So then travel considerations, very important. And, we don't think about travel with the indoor sports, but also if you've got bad weather, you get airport delays. It takes you an extra hour and a half, 2 hours to get where you're going because the roads are bad. Those are things that can factor in the equation here too, especially if you're playing multiple road games in a row, or as we know, we talk about Division I college football. You've got a major airport, or at least a semi-major airport in just about all of those cities. That is not at all the case in Division I college basketball, where you may fly in somewhere, have a 2.5, 3 hour bus trip to get where you're going. Again, obviously it doesn't have as much of an impact on gameplay, but the mindset of the team can certainly be thrown off if you've had miserable travel days, as all of us have had before.
Right. And the thing about it is everybody understands that that's the case in college football, but almost nobody would consider it in college basketball. And that's the difference as well, is that, this is something that most people wouldn't even think about. So it's not a huge factor, but it's something that needs to be part of your handicap, certainly.
Now, I got a question for you here. Friday, I do a local radio spot here in the Cleveland area, and I got a question about Kentucky losing to Evansville. And, what does it mean from a handicapping standpoint with Kentucky? And I just said, look, they just shot the ball really, really poorly in that game. A lot of roster turnover, young but very talented team. These things are going to happen. Not looking at Kentucky specifically, but a team like Florida has 2 losses already. Ohio State crushed Villanova at home. Purdue has lost a couple of games already. So some of these top teams, some of these very well-known teams, off to very slow starts. What does that mean to you here in the month of November when it comes to college basketball?
Yeah, I just think things like that are going to happen. Obviously you wouldn't expect Kentucky to lose to Evansville at home, but I think what you said was really important, that it's a really young team. They beat Michigan State. They come home and beat Eastern Kentucky by, a kabillion points, and then they come back and they think it's going to be really easy. It's easy for them to get into that mindset. And outside of Kentucky, the same thing would be true at other schools. You have a totally different team in a lot of these cases. And, you have to really adjust quite a bit. Some of these other teams that they're playing against in these smaller conferences actually have guys who have played there for several years in a row. That's something that we've talked about sometimes in past years, I believe. But, some of these mid-major teams are more experienced than are the big name teams. And that gives them a bit of advantage in a spot like that because there has been continuity. So I think that, we're bound to see some huge upsets like that. I don't think it makes me change my opinion of Kentucky very much. I mean, I think that, if they continually play down week after week, then it's going to make me want to adjust Kentucky more. But, things like that happen in college basketball. I'll never forget when years ago, the last time when Michigan State won the national title. And growing up from right around there, I thought it was really something that Wright State beat Michigan State. The Raiders beat Wright State, and then the Raiders beat Michigan State, and then Michigan State won the title. That was when they had Morris Peterson and Mateen Cleaves. I mean, it just happens. You have really good teams lose to teams that are far lesser. I just wouldn't. I wouldn't overreact to something like that.
All right, I'm going to put you on the spot here, and then we'll get into our 3 game breakdowns. Who is the most surprising team in the country to you here so far?
Man, most surprising team in the country. That is a on-the-spot type of question. I'm probably going to try to go under the radar with this one. I don't want to pick some big-name school that has done really well. I will say the biggest disappointment to me so far this year has been Florida, a team that you mentioned. I do think Florida will still be a good team. I'm surprised that they've played as poorly as they have so far this year. I'm going to go way under the radar and say I'm really surprised. I know they haven't played a good schedule, but I'm really surprised that DePaul is 5-0. DePaul won at Iowa by 15 points. That one really surprised me quite a bit. They haven't played anybody else good. But DePaul, I would have expected them to be a really bad team this year. They lose Kane. I thought DePaul would be a very weak Big East team. Either Iowa did not play as well as I would expect or isn't as good as I would think, or DePaul was a bit better than I thought they would be. That would be my under-the-radar better team than expected. Other than that, I would say that some other teams that have impressed me quite a bit. Louisville has been really impressive. Look, they're not under the radar, so I didn't want to say Louisville. That was my first thought. I think Louisville is really playing good basketball. They're a really well-coached team. I think they'll be a dangerous team this year, but those are a couple of the teams that kind of stand out to me.
How good is Chris Mack? I mean, the team that he inherited last year with everything going on around that program gets them into the tournament. Yeah, obviously, they left the tournament early, but I mean, I wasn't expecting anything from them last year, and now they're off to another good start. Chris Mack, he's a dude, man. He's really good.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess you could argue that Texas has been pretty impressive also to start the season. The win at Purdue, some pretty comfortable wins, too, against their lesser opponents. Maybe Shaka Smart will get it turned around at Texas. Remains to be seen. They've done pretty well in non-conference before and then struggled in the conference season, but certainly a team to keep an eye on.
I gave you an opportunity to give Rick Barnes some props, man. Tennessee with that win over Washington. And not only that, they were not great on the offensive glass in that game. They just weren't that good. They only had 6 offensive rebounds against that Washington zone and still won by double digits. That's a damn good showing for Rick Barnes' team.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that when I saw that Rick Barnes' team, I suggested that they may be the right side last week, I was pretty nervous. That's you feel like you really get away with one if Rick Barnes' team covers and looks really good for you. So I feel like I'm, living right now based on that.
Well, I mean, we beat up so many teams and so many programs in the college football segment. We might as well have some good thoughts here about somebody on the college basketball side. Like I said, we try to look under the radar here on this segment. It's what we love to do. We love to dig deep as we possibly can to find some games and some different angles to talk about here. So it should come as no surprise to anybody who's listened to Handicapping the Hardwood for a while. If you're new to the show, I promise you it is very important to stick around because we do talk about a lot of good stuff here, a lot of under the radar types of things. But it should come as no surprise to our regular, longtime, loyal listeners that we start with Montana State and Grand Canyon.
Yeah, I mean, please stick around, even though we're talking about Montana State and Grand Canyon. So I apologize, Adam, if there's been a lot of people just kind of stop listening right at this point. But yeah, I mean, seriously, it is, these are good things to handicap. And I'm not necessarily saying that, I think that you should play these 3 games right away. What I'm trying to do is help everybody see that these are good ways to try to handicap college basketball games. Montana State, this is a really tough spot for them. Look what they just did. They were at a neutral site tournament in North Carolina, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, three games, 3 days. Now they play at Grand Canyon on Tuesday. Now, I mean, you don't really have to be a geography major to know that that's not very close to each other. And they just played 3 games in North Carolina. Grand Canyon has a tremendous home court advantage. Very, very difficult spot. Grand Canyon is disappointed so far this year. Montana State's coach is doing a really good job, better than I could have ever imagined so far this year. It's certainly one of the biggest upside surprises I've seen so far this year has been Montana State. They played a really tight game against Utah State on the road, which said a lot. They beat UNC Greensboro on the road. This Montana State team looks good. Here's the thing is this is a really, really bad spot for them. What kind of reaction are the odds makers going to have in this one? If Grand Canyon's favored by a small amount, 5, 4.5, something like that, I would have to take Grand Canyon in this game if I'm taking a side because Grand Canyon is a pretty good team, or they're supposed to be a pretty good team, and I think they're a well-coached team. This is a really bad spot for Montana State. This is one of those where you go against Montana State and they beat you here. It just, it wasn't the wrong play. It was, the wrong result. I feel like these are the kind of spots that you want to look for.
I like this one a lot. 4 games in 5 days is a lot in any sport, especially college basketball. And also, too, in that tournament over in North Carolina, the Appalachian State win was by 3 points. The Greensboro win was by a point. They did wind up playing really well defensively against Tennessee Tech. They won that one by 13. But still, you played 2 very close games Friday and Saturday in that tournament. And now you go all the way from North Carolina out to the Phoenix area for Grand Canyon. That is a very, very bad spot. And again, that's something where the odds makers may look at it and say, oh, well, Montana State's 4-1. And, we had no expectations for them. They're 1 loss. Utah State, they played well. Maybe they get a little bit overinflated here, and maybe that spot's not even factored into the equation at all.
Yeah, that's the hope. Let's see. I mean, because if you think about this one very much, you do realize that this is a very bad spot for Montana State. And like I said, this is not saying that Montana State couldn't go to Grand Canyon and win by 10 points. It could happen. It's just that these are the type of spots that you want to isolate. If you isolate spots like this consistently, you're going to do well in college basketball. This is one of the worst spots you'll ever see, playing 4 games in 5 days that far apart from each other.
And for that being said, that game is Tuesday night, just to make sure everybody's clear on that. So we'll get a number this afternoon for it. And again, I imagine astute handicappers will have an idea of that spot. So that's one that, you definitely want to keep a close eye on here with the overnight lines. If one should be posted for that game, I would think that one probably would. We go to Wednesday night here, Belmont and Lipscomb. Now, this isn't as far under the radar as Montana State and Grand Canyon, but there's a lot to unpack about this game.
Yeah, Casey Alexander up against his old team. Acuff is a coach that I think highly of for Lipscomb. I think he'll do a good job with this team. How much time is it going to take is the question mark. You look at what they did in their last game against Duquesne. They scored 36 points. There were 70 possessions in that game, 0.51 points per possession. I don't know. It's going to be really rare that you see worse than that. 0.51 points per possession is just really, really ugly. They turned it over more times than they made shots from the floor, which is pretty difficult to do. But, will Lipscomb want to run in this game with Alexander's more talented team? Now, I don't think they should. I think that Lipscomb should try to switch up their defenses. I know that they are probably going to be playing some zone and some man defense. I think they probably want to do that in this game, mix it up, try to slow Belmont down. Belmont was disappointing in their first game of the year. They went to Illinois State, lost 79-72. Then they win by 32 points against Samford at home. And then they go to Boston College and win 100-85. Really impressive game there from Belmont. So I'm curious to see, what kind of line comes out on this game. Belmont clearly the better team. You would think both teams would be very motivated for this one.
Well, and again, we like to look ahead as much as we possibly can here on the show. Couple of things. One, Lipscomb was 0 for 18 from 3 in their last game. Duquesne was 1 for 22. They lost by 22 points to a team that was 1 for 22 from 3. That is very hard to do. But Belmont here, first game of a 4-game road trip. Over the span of 10 days, they play on the road at Lipscomb, at St. Louis, at Eastern Washington, and then come back closer to play at Middle Tennessee State. So difficult travel schedule for Belmont here. Looks like they should be a favorite at Eastern Washington next Tuesday. That's the game that I would circle. But this game definitely has a lot of intrigue to it, too, here against Lipscomb.
Yeah, and I think that depending on how this game goes, we may find some good opportunity to go against one or both of these teams right after that, because this is going to be a highly emotional game. You've got Lipscomb plays Friday at Navy after playing Wednesday night here against Belmont, and then Belmont going on that really tough road trip, like you said. I would think that there will be some good spots to fade one or maybe even both of these teams coming out of this game.
One more game to talk about here on Handicapping the Hardwood. These are two programs that are not good at all at football, but they're pretty good at college basketball. New Mexico and New Mexico State. It's a good segue here. I think it's a good finish to today's segment because we'll talk a lot of rivalry games in college football next week. This is a pretty good, pretty spirited rivalry.
This is a really good rivalry. I don't think people realize how big of a rivalry game this is. Last year, New Mexico State won both times. This is interesting in that they play twice, even though they're not in the same conference. So they see a lot of each other. New Mexico wants to push the pace, play really, really fast. They're going to press. They want it to be, 80 possessions in the game. New Mexico State last year beat them, even though both of those games were played very fast. If you look at New Mexico State so far this year, they're 346th. And tempo. So they have played really, really slow on an average possession length. So New Mexico State, I think, probably wants to slow the game down here. They probably slightly less talented than they were last year, New Mexico State. I would think that this is a good spot here based on how Tuesday's game against UTEP goes for New Mexico. If New Mexico wins big at UTEP, has a nice win there, I would consider laying the short number here with New Mexico State. But both these teams have a really good home court advantage. So that's worth quite a bit in this game. And New Mexico State comes into it better rested than does New Mexico. I feel like this is a spot where it's set up for New Mexico State to have a good situational spot and then possibly go against New Mexico State in that second game when they play New Mexico. What is it? Only 3 weeks later or so. So let's see what happens against UTEP on Tuesday. I think that will be an interesting one to watch as far as, how it will affect this line. I do think that, if New Mexico State's a really short favorite, they might be the right side here because if you look at what New Mexico's done so far this year, they've played 4 games at home. The best team that they've played so far this year is Green Bay. So this is a New Mexico team that is definitely untested so far this year.
Yeah, and of course that game at UTEP in a little bit of altitude. So again, people probably don't think too much about that in Conference USA. We'll talk about it as the year goes along, but there is some altitude there in El Paso. So a quick turnaround here then to take on your arch rival. And quite frankly, maybe UTEP is a good play on Tuesday night with maybe a little bit of a look-ahead factor there for New Mexico in that one. Professional handicapper Kyle Hunter over at huntersportspicks.com. What's going on over there right now, man?
Yeah, I've got a special going on here. Rest of the year, college basketball plays $579. 1 month college basketball subscription for $189 if you want to just try it out for a little bit. Mention the Bang the Book special offer. Send me a message at Kyle Hunter Picks on Twitter. or KyleHunterSportsPicks.com by email. If you're looking for just free content only, that's fine too. You can sign up for the free picks newsletter at HunterSportsPicks.com. 2-0 again this past weekend on those free picks. Now 89 and 55 in the last 144.
And make sure you follow Kyle on Twitter at KyleHunterPicks. Kyle Hunter, HunterSportsPicks.com. Always a treat, man. Always a pleasure. Great to have you back on the show. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, man. Take care.